Welcome back to Moto Italia. This is episode 2 of the Griso 1208V rebuild. Since the last episode, I've had some help lifting the frame back onto the engine. All 4 mounting bolts have been torqued to spec. The 2 front bolts, the Allen head bolts, are torqued to 80 Newton meters, and the 2 rear bolts, the long through bolts, are torqued to 50 Newton meters. I've also installed brand new steering head bearings. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to get any footage of that process. Sorry about that. I promise to do better in future episodes. I've even picked up an extra camera so I can capture more close-ups and details going forward. The new bearing was fully packed with grease and torqued down firmly. This type of bearing sees far more vibration than actual movement, so it's critical that it's properly tightened, with zero play at all. If there's even the slightest looseness, vibrations will cause the bearing to wear a small notch in the straight ahead position. That notch creates a detent feeling in the steering, and it can make the bike feel like you have to force it to begin a turn. I've also tapped the lock washer for the bearing's lock nut into place and mounted the upper triple clamp, but I'm leaving the centre nut loose for now. That will only be tightened once the fork legs are installed and everything else is torqued to spec. Next up is servicing the front forks. I start by sliding the fork legs into the triple clamps and lightly tightening a few of the lower clamp bolts. This holds the fork legs in place so I can safely loosen the top caps. With the fork secured, I adjust the preload on the top caps to the minimum setting. That relieves tension on the spring and makes it easier to remove the top cap without damaging the threads. I'll only show the full process on one fork leg since both sides are identical. Once the top cap is loose, I remove the fork leg from the clamps and secure it in a bench vise using soft plastic jaw protectors to avoid damaging the surface of the fork tube. After that, I unscrew the top cap completely from its threads and slide the outer fork tube all the way down to the bottom. Now it's time to use a special tool to push the spring spacer sleeve down and relieve the pressure from the spring against the top cap. To keep the sleeve compressed, I hook a ratchet strap onto the tool and gently pull it back. That takes the spring pressure off the top cap and gives me access to the damping rod. Once the pressure is off and both nuts on the damping rod are exposed, I can loosen the lock nut on the rod. This allows the top cap to come free and be unscrewed completely. When the top cap is fully unthreaded, I lift it, along with the compression adjustment rod, all the way out of the fork. Be careful not to lose the nylon washer that sits on top of the spring spacer sleeve. It's a good idea to place all the parts on the workbench in the exact order they came out to make reassembly easier later. Next out is the spring spacer sleeve itself. At this point I release the ratchet strap and let all the pressure off the spring. Once the tension is gone, I can remove both the spacer sleeve and the spring from the fork. With all the internals removed, I flip the fork leg upside down over a drain pan to let the old oil pour out. To get as much oil out as possible, I repeatedly pump the damping rod and outer fork tube. You'll feel the resistance gradually fade, and once that's gone, the fork is nearly dry. I replaced the fork seals and oil just last year, and I haven't had any leaks since, so I know everything inside is in good condition. That means I can skip disassembly of the lower fork and go straight to reassembly. First, I drop the initial spacer along with its nylon washer back into the fork leg. Before reinstalling the spring and the spring spacer sleeve, it's time to add fresh fork oil and set the oil level. I start by pouring in slightly less oil than the specified amount. Then I pump the damping rod several times until I feel it engages smoothly all the way through the stroke, both on compression and rebound. The correct oil level for these Showa forks is 95mm from the top of the outer tube. This measurement is taken with both the spring and the preload spacer removed. I use a caliper to check the oil level as I fill, and once I feel the damping is consistent and the level is close, I double check with a syringe fitted with a 95mm hose. When I can no longer draw out any oil with the syringe, I know the oil level is set correctly. With the fork fully filled with fresh oil, it's time to put everything back together. First, I reinstall the spring and the preload spacer sleeve into the fork leg, making sure everything goes in the same order it came out. Once the sleeve is in place, I reattach the special tool to compress it again. Then I tighten the ratchet strap to apply pressure, which gives me access to the damping rod so I can reinstall the top cap. With the rod exposed, I screw the top cap back onto the damping rod and tighten it against the lock nut. Once everything is tightened back together inside the fork, it's time to slide the outer fork tube back up toward the top cap. I thread the top cap into the outer tube by hand, just using a bit of firm wrist strength for now. This isn't the final torque. It will be properly tightened to spec later once both fork legs are installed and aligned. Now it's time to inspect and clean the fork seals. First, I carefully push down the dust seal and clean thoroughly in and around the sealing area. Then I apply a thin layer of assembly grease on the fork tube itself before sliding the dust seal back into position. When I pump the fork leg now, a small amount of this grease is drawn into the fork seal and ends up sitting between the inner and outer sealing lips. This helps reduce what's known as fork stiction, the sticking effect that can happen if the seals are completely dry. Mounting the fork legs is straightforward at this point. For now, I simply slide them into the triple clamps. No need to worry about exact height or torque yet. We'll fine tune the position and torque everything to spec later in the series. That's it for this episode. The forks are fully serviced and mounted, and the front end is really starting to take shape. In the next episode, we'll install the swing arm, the monoshock, and the carc unit. We'll also return to the front end to torque all the bolts to spec. And I'll share a helpful tip on how to avoid failure in the carc system. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay fast, stay classic, stay Italian.